Hello dear friends, today is the 11th of July, Friday. Today I have the most important material for you as I consider it. I will start with the fact that I will try to make a diagnosis. What does the course of Washington in the foreseeable future depend on in relation to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, NATO, Europe, respectively, in relation to the evil axis? That is, what does the foreign policy of the United States depend on for a fairly long period on a global scale? I think that abstractly speaking, this question is determined by two parties. I would call the first party the Gesheft party or the Babla party, which is now known by the New York developer. Steve Witkoff. The meaning of this Gesheft is clear. Foreign policy is a way to make a lot of money. The second party, I would call it the Chislava party, the narcissism party, the ego party. Well, let's do it this way. Who likes the ego party or the Chislava party? And in the end, they converge in the soul of one person. Different people influence it, but the struggle and resolution of this conflict occur in the soul of one person. Geshev's party is, of course, a pro-Putin, pro-Russian, pro-orc party. The meaning of its specific plans is the achievement of multi-billion contracts, the division of the European carbon market. I would say that one of the architects of this plan is considered to be the one who settles it, the one who becomes the richest person. Until the end of that century, until coal is used on the ground. The second party is, yes, it is Czechoslovakia. And if you ask how they combine with each other, what are their chances, I would say that from the point of view of healthy logic, Czechoslovakia should win. Why? Because healthy logic, cheapness can be done and money can, in the language of the St. Petersburg suburb, be cut off through a lot of options. The Middle East is a very rich country and they have endless opportunities in this respect. You can buy coins now, too, an endless opportunity. Announce new coins, call them differently, please. Well, this is another option. But if you lose, that is, if you win in terms of, and in accordance with the possibilities of the ego or Czechoslovakia parties, then you will earn money. But if you lose to the parties of narcissism, Czechoslovakia, ego, then you will turn yourself into a third-rate small political figure in the era of the extinction of the American and Western civilization in general. Who will give you money after that? This, from the point of view of common sense. Therefore, I believe in common logic that in the end, on a global scale, it will win. If this did not happen, we would still live in the Stone Age. Therefore, I hope that the second party will win. And the signs are literally the last days, you can even say the last hours. Signs of that, gentlemen, that the ego and Czechoslovakia start to prevail. They are basically in the face. In this name of Czechoslovakia, let's say, I do not see any negative meanings, because Czechoslovakia, by and large, is what the world is turning on. As the poet wrote, the peak of honor, our idol, is what the world is turning on, what provides progress, civilization. This makes people to a significant extent charmed with their own fame, and they reach incredible heights and bring good for humanity. There are negative moments, but in this case, it should play a positive role. So the last event is evidence that the party of fame is starting to prevail. To a significant extent, this was contributed by the Kremlin's pale mall, who overplayed. He overstrained the situation, let's say, he relaxed, he allowed himself to be intolerant, and he came to the fore with the second party, the party of fame. And you know, the representative of the party of fame, he sometimes loves something, sometimes very often says that. Biden, I compared to Biden, Olaf bargain, Biden is, roughly speaking, bad, but here I am Superman. In a significant part, still, in any case, these comparisons are tight and not always justified, to put it mildly. But if he fulfills the plan of the party of fame, then he may later say that Biden could not. Biden turned out. To be weak, and I Superman, I tore the wing of the Kremlin's pale molle and turned her shoulder into a mushroom in the Kremlin pit. I am great. I did the feat of the 21st century. And everyone will have to agree. That's why I really hope for the victory of this party of fame, and there are notes that its representatives switched to the offensive. So just recently, a few hours ago, it became known that Trump reached an agreement with the representatives of the European countries of NATO on the supply of weapons to Ukraine. Through NATO countries, not through NATO as an organization, but through NATO countries. That is, the Americans supply weapons, the Europeans pay, the United States receives profits. In contrast, as they will say, from the Biden administration, well, then NATO countries supply this to Ukraine. This is a completely different turn of events that the Kremlin was so afraid of. It is not only about the defense of weapons, but about any weapon, even offensive. As long as the United States can work, so much will be put. And for these purposes, I think, it will not be a very big problem to confiscate $300 billion and send it to the development of the US GDP and the European one. That is, this is the first most important agreement, what I told you in the previous videos, what Moscow was afraid of. Now they can sadly state that the so-called Bidenization of Trump has happened. Now it's his war, not even his war, it's his Gesheft, you know, the master of Gesheft, it's his Gesheft now. The second important moment. For the first time in a meeting or at the meeting of the coalition of those wishing, these are the countries that expressed their readiness to send their military contingents to Ukraine, after there will be a truce in order to ensure the compliance of this truce. For the first time in the world, the United States of America participated in the role of General Kellogg, even with Biden, who provided great military assistance. In Ukraine, the United States did not express their willingness to send its military contingent there. For the first time, and this is all happening right now, gentlemen, in front of our eyes. Merz, Chancellor of Germany, sent a clear message to Putin: we do not surrender. Europe accepted the challenge. Go ahead, gentlemen. Well, there they fell through all their possibilities. What does the Kremlin do when it smells like fried food? What do its propaganda media do? They talk about Poseidons, about terrible rockets, most often cartoons. But now, the Kremlin, realizing that all of this is rubbish, no one in the West is listening to it. In Russia, as I told you yesterday, in Russia they don't listen to it anymore. And what can the West say? Through its capabilities in the Western media. By the way, the Western intelligence services should track where their feet grow in these materials. So in the newspaper Telegraph, in principle a respectable newspaper, a material appears right now. If Putin is brought to despair, he will use tactical nuclear weapons. But how much can it be? How long can it take? Adults, British, Telegraph, I did not expect from them. Okay, there is some kind of underground newspaper, but the Telegraph, I just did not expect. This is a manifestation of the Kremlin hysteria. They are spying on their valuable, conspired channels of the implementation of active measures. That's what it is. Lavrov meeting with Rubio yesterday, Kuala Lumpur, rushed urgently to North Korea. And what is he going to do there? He will agree on the supplies of a new contingent of cannon fodder, and apparently there are shells, rockets, and something like that. In short, the ice has thrown, gentlemen, on the jury. We are watching the fight of two parties that take place in Washington, and its focus is the White House. Well, I told you, according to the statistics of YouTube, this channel is watched by representatives of more than 42 countries of the world. And we have very respected viewers and listeners from France, friendly France. I told you about this in the Journalist-Investigator, who, when their passions were raging, the accusations were flying that the Northern Stream 2 was blown up by Ukrainian special forces. They even mentioned the name of Colonel Chervinsky. This respected journalist conducted his investigation, a brilliant investigation. I told you about him, gave a link to this investigation. That is, this is a man known in France, a journalist investigator and a brilliant Russian speaker. Here he sent me several materials. One of them is a speech by the head of the General Staff of France, where he spoke about Russia and the current situation. He recommended me to get acquainted with this material and wrote, he says, "It seems that he, the head of the General Staff of France, is listening to your channel." Well, this of course means that what he said is embedded there in accordance with the thesis that we have already discussed here. Yes, of course, it sounds absurd, but there are other explanations of how it could have happened. One alternative explanation is to say, we have our sources in the General Staff of France, which allows us to know what they are talking about before their boss comes out with public speeches. This is a joke, I hope you understood. I was joking. I don't have any sources in the General Staff of France. Well, another option. I think this is most likely how it happened. You see, when professionals in some field discuss the situation or event in this field, their opinion is often the same. Because they know what they are talking about. They know the fact, they know, as they say in America, the protocols or modus operandi or operative handwriting. They know how it all happens. Therefore, it does not matter whether it is France, whether it is Germany, whether it is the United States, even Russia. I am sure that there are generals there who understand everything, how the situation actually is. But in Russia, the situation is the same as in Germany. In Germany, in World War II, the German generals knew about the Wehrmacht. They were very suspicious of what would happen to the caput, starting, I think, at least from December of 1942. They understood that Hitler was leading the case to the destruction of Germany, to defeat, but there was little they could do, but they understood everything. So I will definitely make a material on this. There are even more interesting materials. There is not only the head of the General Staff of France, but also one of the leaders of the French Special Services, also a unique material. And finally, one, as is considered the leading expert politologist of France, and all the same, I would say, optimistic views on the situation and its prospects, and today I would like to draw your attention, attract and disassemble the most interesting, in any case for me, material. This is analytical material written by General Valery Zaluzhny. In general, I believe that such materials need to be printed in large Western analytical buildings. I think that the general will start doing this sooner or later, because in this material there is a brilliant characteristic of the present moment, how it emerged, and this is a unique thing. I do not often meet such conclusions and analytical materials in the best American and British journals and thought factories. But it is enough for me to say first. Do you know or do you suspect that the war that Russia started in February 1922 and the one that is happening now are completely different battles, different armaments, different ways of conducting combat actions? Different VPCs have to work on this, they have to make different decisions. And if now the military, the leaders of some armed forces of the country, the participants of the conflict, plan to carry out their actions, it will be a complete failure in February 1922. Then what is the main thing now? What should we pay attention to? And so on. That is, this is a unique material, so I broke it down. It is quite detailed. I think that it must be read completely. Anyone who wants to get to know it can go to the site of the Ukrainian Truth, and I broke it down to the main theses so that the flow of thought became more clear and what needs to be done. That is, I think this is a brilliant analysis of where we are now, an explanation of how we ended up there and what is most important, what needs to be done next. I received a couple of messages that the general should fight and not be an ambassador. I absolutely agree with the fact that the general should fight, but this is a question for those who fired the general. Although the main media of the United States, when his release was preparing, warned that there would be a catastrophe. Therefore, I had several videos about this on the channel, and so it was said, it will be a catastrophe. It happened, therefore you should ask those who, nevertheless knowing, being warned, made such a decision. As for you, the ambassador, you know the United States of America, about 250 years ago, announced independence. The war began for independence from the metropolis, from Great Britain. Big money is needed for the war. Where to get this money when there are not so many countries that have them? And then Benjamin Franklin was sent to Paris with the task of asking for money. He was experienced a diplomat by nature. Having got there, quickly assessed the situation. Paris, Versailles, it was a city and a palace of sin. People committed all kinds of sins. But he entered this situation, began to lead the appropriate way of life. And here, with impatience, they expected money. The money had not yet come in. But someone wrote that a person meets with ladies there, participates in all kinds of parties, and there is no money. Then another seriously motivated person was sent there, who later became the second president of the United States, John Adams. And he came there, tried to build Franklin, came to receive the king and the minister said, "What's the matter? How long can we wait? Where?" Is the money? Where is the squadron? You sent 12 ships, are you laughing? We need 10 times more. So he sent them. After that, from Paris to Washington, Congress sent a letter to remove this idiot. He was not an idiot, he was a good person, but he had a different character, and they removed him because they said, "We will not give him a penny." And so it continued. And Benjamin Franklin, he, by and large, bankrupted France. He took out so much money from it, loans and aid, that the royal treasury turned out to be completely empty. And there were bad years, it was such a harsh winter. And in order to replenish the treasury emptied by the American War for Independence, the king was forced to raise taxes. The people fluttered. The revolution ended. The king and the queen were beheaded. The monarchy fell. This is how France, through Benjamin Franklin's ambassador, secured the victory of the war for independence. If it weren't for Franklin, who knows, there would still be the United States of America, or it would still be some territory of the British Crown. And when Franklin taught John Adams, who had already left, how to engage in diplomacy, he said, talk less, be quiet, run, fuss. In general, you have to work so that it is not noticeable. Like you rarely work, but then you make a blow to defeat 100%, you make a result. That's how it is. I hope you noticed. The victory, independence of the United States, they owe Benjamin Franklin, the ambassador to Paris. And so, by and large, the compatriots appreciated it, and the descendants too. Because now the image of George Washington is based on a $1 bill, the first president of the United States. And the image of Benjamin Franklin, who never became president of the United States, although he was among the founding fathers, it is based on a $100 bill. That's how it is, gentlemen. Therefore, the ambassador is not an ambassador, but I will tell you that the material is brilliant. I recommend getting acquainted. So let's go. Diagnosis. Where are we now? Reading this material or listening to it, you will really understand what kind of war we are in now, what are our chances, what needs to be done to win, and what can happen in either case. Let's go. The diagnosis of the era. The post-war world order is destroyed. The war in Ukraine has become the last nail in the coffin of its coffin. The United States is no longer able to define global rules. Their indecision only confirms this. Trump's return is not an accident, but an expression of a historical shift. America is leaving itself. The world is moving to another phase. The fear of a possible defeat of Russia, which was experienced by some in Washington, in the capital of the European states, led to a prolonged war and an increase in financial and political costs for a prolonged war, and this, first of all, affected the economy. Inflation went there, and people in these Western countries began to show dissatisfaction. And so the manifestation of this dissatisfaction became the growth of the right-wing parties in the country and the danger of the coming of the right-wing parties in Europe. And in the United States, Donald Trump came to the back of the support of the MAGA. In the United States, the political discourse and a separate decision are increasingly focused on internal priorities, internal issues which put in doubt, of course, the continuation of the help of Ukraine. You know, the whole meaning of America First, according to the interpretation of the MAGA. Even worse, the help of Ukraine itself. Ukraine becomes dependent on internal political fluctuations, and we see this. This is the May wind, which I have repeatedly told you about, which blows here and there. This is now a confrontation between these two Danai boys, the Gesheft party and the Ego or Chislava party. And all this happens against the background of an amazing technological breakthrough in a number of determining sectors, such as energy, IT technologies, especially artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, new materials, biotechnology, and others. In connection with this unprecedented breakthrough, or even a breakthrough in the technological area, is happening in the perestroika of the economy of the state. The needs and priorities are changing, which have even switched to priorities which have never been in the production of useful and excavated materials. What is needed now, first of all, in the first place, is rare land materials. All this led to the rapid development of the means of armed struggle. And from here, the parameters of armed struggle, the parameters of force and the power of the state have changed. And here is the conclusion to which the general comes. This will be the basis for the formation of the future world order, and this will determine the subjectivity of its members. For many, the term subjectivity of its members is incomprehensible. That is, who will you be? Who will be the country in this? Or is this a country that will be a full member of the new world order? Will it have its own national interests and defend them? Or will it be a second or degree state that will point out to others how it should live? The next block, this is the characteristic of the present moment. Ukraine is not an object, but a factor of the new architecture. It became obvious that today cheap and mass weapons are able to exhaust very expensive and powerful weapons. All this, as it were, gives Ukraine a chance to withstand the blow and form asymmetric strategies. Remember, at the end of about 1922, what types of weapons were demanded from Ukraine for America to install? Hundreds of tanks, thousands of planes, again thousands of armored vehicles, and so on. Everything was so powerful, steel, armored, high-flying. Now no one even talks about it. Where are they at all? Where did they all go? Tanks are buried in the ground and work like gobbets. All this was a scientific and technical breakthrough. And it worked well for Ukraine because the amount of this powerful, old technology in the outskirts of Russia is immeasurably more than in Ukraine. God was on our side. He changed the nature of the war. Now there are drones that make these segments of the front, turning them into craters of death or hell, where everything alive is destroyed. Alive force and armored vehicles if they stay there for more than 15 minutes. And these are drones. That is what the general writes about. That is, on the one hand, it worked in favor of Ukraine. However, the inability to provide itself with all the spectrum of defense capabilities, which, alas, Ukraine suffers, puts in doubt the possibility of long resistance in the conditions of war on exhaustion. Roughly speaking, the country to a large extent continues to depend on external supplies. Despite the fact that inside, as they say, up to 40% of the required weapons are made within the country. Long-term war on exhaustion turns Ukraine into a global mega-purchaser of weapons or importer of weapons. Despite the previously unseen prospects for the development of the internal VPK, today, writes the general, the main point of support at the front remains the Ukrainian soldier. This is a very important thought, gentlemen. I read it, and for me it was a very, very valuable thought. Because this is where a lot of other things come from. Namely, right now, on the front line, a person is receiving a numerous level of physical and psychological pressure that has not been seen in the history of wars. That is, it was always possible to hide in a dugout, in a trench, like in the First World War. But now the situation is completely different. Mass use of technology, first of all drones, turned a person on the battlefield into a permanent target. Permanent for defeat within a day, at any time of the day, within a year. You know, the colossal. I imagined everything on the place of this soldier. It's just a hero. There was no such thing even during the Second World War, during the most difficult battles, which ended with a break. Now there is no such break. What should be done in this situation? The general writes. In this regard, Ukraine needs a new paradigm of soldier defense, and this is escalated air defense. And for this, Ukraine urgently needs technological alliances and not just supplies, so that these supplies are not as they are now. With smuggling through smuggling, with a stretched arm, give, supply from the United States, supply from Germany. And all this depends on how these two parties of power, which I initially called, how they relate to this particular moment. There are such miracles as in the court of Ludovic XVI during the French struggle for independence. There were also their own miracles. And all this affects the situation on the battlefield. All this affects the fate of Ukraine. The question must be solved in the most urgent way. The main principle of modern war is when cheap and mass weapons are able to extort very expensive and powerful weapons. Just as these drones can extort or destroy tanks and other armored vehicles. It is air defense that requires radical decisions, which, without attracting advanced or already known technologies, is simply impossible. Under such a number of attack means, and now they have already exceeded 700 in one night, the number of means of defeat that flies from Russia to the sky of Ukraine. Under such a number of attack means, it is simply impossible to build a PVO system and too expensive means in production. That is, combat kits and the number of Patriot batteries will not be enough to defend the country from such a large. Territory means the means of defeat. Something else needs to be built on modern principles and much cheaper. This fact itself, perhaps, is extremely important for the construction of the future of not only Ukraine, but also future alliances. Thus, international support remains not only a key factor in the preservation of our statehood, but also a factor in the acquisition of the necessary abilities of the likely allies of Ukraine. What is it about? About the fact that those discoveries on the battlefield that are taking place in Ukraine and their contemplation by Ukrainian military leaders do not open their eyes to generals in the same Pentagon, in the General Staff of France, in the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Great Britain and other NATO countries. But then I will tell you, it turns out that in America, I am telling you for sure, under the leadership of the current minister, they did not fully realize what was happening there. It is still about the need for construction of a new system, a new Patriot battery, which will be built for several years and in limited quantities. But the sky will not be closed. You have to think about something else, more massive, more effective, cheaper. And this is a strategic task of the United States, because you can talk here in Washington as much as you want about the fact that we are sitting and preparing for the war with China. But if here in the Pentagon they do not know about the new trends of war that appear in Ukraine, then they will again prepare not for a new war with China, but for a war, well, at least let's say in February 1922, and then the Second World War. And this will be a loss even before the beginning of military actions with China. Where to look for allies, where to look for help? Europe is the next section. This is an ally, but not a guarantor of our victory, as the general thinks. The European Union is unable to quickly transform and is still dependent on the United States. The public opinion in the EU is a factor of instability of support for Ukraine. The electorate is not ready to sacrifice, and we talked about this in detail with you. This is what is happening. The electorate did not realize the scale and reality of the threat from Pakistan. Therefore, the need to tighten the belt a little leads to discontent, and this leads to the growth of the right-wing popularization, and this is about the Putin party and so on. I quoted one of the leaders of the European Union who said, we know what to do, but we don't know what to do. It's our electorate when we do what we Now, this is a problem, therefore, as the general writes, in such conditions one should hope for long-term and, most importantly, for the necessary today and stable assistance. One should be extremely careful, that is, one should hope that it will come well, but one should only hope for it. It would be, apparently, negligible. The following is the United States. This is the last opportunity and the only chance, as follows from the analytical material of Valery Zaluzhny. The situation requires immediate measures to restore the attention of the United States to the support of Ukraine. Well, you see, apparently he wrote this when this issue was completely in a suspended state. And this was about a week ago when the help that Donald Trump is now saying was suspended. And I did not even know that it was suspended. That's why Geralt writes that the situation requires immediate measures to restore, and it has already been restored. The Pale Molly helped restore the attention to itself on the head of the same Pale Molly. As Geralt writes, Washington has huge but unusable reserves of outdated weapons. For example, according to him, now in the United States there are about 170,000 Hellfire missiles. They were made in 1998, in my opinion, and ended in 2018. And the duration of their operation is about 20-25 years. In short, a significant part, for almost all of them, they now belong simply to writing and utilization. Apparently, it was a good problem, that is, a rocket for the battlefield given its number. This is an original air-to-earth rocket, but it can be installed on land, on sea platforms. The range of action is up to 11 kilometers. It is not, as I understand it, its main purpose is to destroy enemy armored vehicles, fortified targets, and all that. And most importantly, the support of Ukraine is a cheap way, as the general writes, to prevent war in Taiwan and in the Middle East. Why? Because, again, we have discussed this a lot with you, and it all coincides with what we know. Because in order to prepare for war with China, we need to do something with Russia. It used to be a misunderstanding. Washington is now, apparently, mature. That before you climb on the owners of a dog, you need to attach this dog. Therefore, the way to a successful confrontation with China lies through the humiliation of a painful, pale prayer in the Kremlin. Therefore, we have repeatedly said that if Ukraine suffers defeat, God forbid, in the war against Russian aggression, then the way to capture China, Taiwan, is open, and no one even whispers in Washington. The first thing Donald Trump will do is take the phone and call Comrade Zai and start discussing the deal. What are we going to do next, and how much it will cost to whom? Therefore, it is already clear, this is the axiom, that the support of Ukraine, maybe this is not understood by Mr. Colby, who last month recommended. He did not make this decision, it was beyond his competence. He recommended to stop the help of Ukraine, although what he stopped is completely unnecessary for China. Completely different types of weapons are required. In short, it is clear that the support of Ukraine is the cheapest way to prevent war in Taiwan, and the war in Taiwan, it may end like this. We assume that it is the best option. Trump raises the phone, calls Comrade Zai, they agree. Well, what if not? What if they agree? In short, the United States is still talking about its unchangeable readiness to do everything it needs in order to ensure the independence of Taiwan, and this is the Third World War potentially. Well, in the Middle East, something like that. For the United States, it is quite possible to get two new theaters of military action at the same time. In the Middle East and in the Asia-Pacific region, this is what we said. They cannot pull this off. Therefore, this European theater, it is not in vain that they want to dump it on the European countries of NATO, and the European countries of NATO are not ready, and the only one who can do this at the moment is Ukraine. That is, Ukraine, at the European theater of military actions, it opposes the entire axis of evil under the leadership of China. China's executor is Putin, and at the same time, he takes active part and is already a living force in a huge number of North Korea in terms of equipment. Weapons, this is Iran. Therefore, as the general writes, if not Ukraine, then it will require participation in the military actions of the armed forces of the Navy of the United States of America, and the cost of such operations for the United States will be incomparably higher than that of the help of Ukraine. The United States can stop both conflicts by demonstrating its strength through the help of Ukraine. That is, this is a new form of demonstration of the strength of the United States. They used to demonstrate the Arsenosis, or they did something else there in the military, in the semi-military plan. Now, with the help of Ukraine, and even through European NATO countries, and even through sales, but this is an unprecedented situation. That is, the United States, without straining, develops a military-industrial complex. They still keep European NATO countries under control, and they control the situation both in Europe and in Southeast Asia. It brings back the ability to control two theaters of military action at the same time that they lost, as they themselves recognized, about 10 years ago. That is, it is an incredible strategic situation. It is a gift of God, one might say. Only it is necessary to inspire it here, but we will talk about it later. About the global consequences, the case of a failure of support for Ukraine was warned by Richard Moore, the former director of British intelligence SIS. Here is his quote: "The cost of support for Ukraine is well known, but the cost of its absence will be incomparably higher. As a result, without the victory of Ukraine, the United States will lose the status of a global leader. And with the help of Ukraine, in the event of victory, they return to the status of a country that can, without resorting to military actions, but in a military, indirect way, control two theaters of military actions of the Southeast and Europe. I repeat, this is just a gift of fate." To summarize, the general says that one can say with confidence that along with the problem of survival and preservation of statehood, in the modern world of order, it is Ukraine that plays the role of the key element of stability. And so it is, based on what we have just discussed with you. The results of our confrontation with the Russian Federation will have a decisive influence not only on internal security, but also on the trajectory of the development of a new global order. And so it's interesting. As far as I understand, Fyodor Zaluzhny studied at a school in the Odessa military school already after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He masterfully mastered dialectics as it was taught in the best philosophical faculties, the best universities of the country in the Soviet Union. That is, he starts from a specific one, from a soldier. He then goes to the abstract, that is, he takes certain facts on Earth, analyzes them and summarizes them, comes up with a global conclusion, and now he will come back from the abstract back to the concrete, the highest level. Hegel, that is, I would say, whether you want to believe it or not, but I don't know if he studied Hegel, but he has a great tool, so he is now returning to the concrete. What should Ukraine do now? Create alliances. By the way, gentlemen, we discussed this with you. Alliances, once again, alliances. This was known and understood by Biden and his administration. Therefore, they confused China with these alliances and Russia. But the new leader in Washington, not understanding this, or contrary, he did not even want to understand because the predecessor did it, so I will destroy him. But now, apparently somehow, he calmed down in this regard. So it is necessary to create alliances of a new type, not to wait, but to form a structure of the future world. And I told you when we discussed this not to ask but to create and offer. Create, I mean, to offer concepts. It is precisely a general writes because of the fundamental changes in the nature of war. Such alliances will be formed right now. They are already being formed. Such alliances are extremely necessary in Ukraine, both for survival now and for future security. I will give you just one example. I have spoken about some companies which are now global, which are transcendental, which, according to the geography of their actions, go beyond the United States and even NATO. They say that the collapse of globalism in the economy, maybe it will be in the economy, although I doubt it in this regard, but there is an IT or through artificial intelligence. Through these private, intellectual military companies, globalization of this new technological, military technological infrastructure is taking place. And thank God the leading companies they treat well, they are allies of Ukraine in its rightful cause. The first difficult task, writes General Zaluzhny, will prove that the lack of support for Ukraine is the main geopolitical risk of the erosion of the role of the United States as the key guarantor of global security. Well, we just explained it to you. It is necessary to explain, yes, because the one who is now sitting in the seat of the Minister of Defense is a space for him, just a space. That is, it is necessary to start with the experts, and now they are considered to be deep state. Well, thank God, now they are somehow remembered, and now these orcs say that now deep state is involving. As a thunderclap involves Donald Trump in his embrace, beep, into the depth of his influence. So it is necessary to prove to the United States that if they do not support, then this is a colossal risk, and the Americans will lose, at both theaters of military action, and this means all over the world. Our main goal, as its host formulated, is to show that the victory of Ukraine is critically important for the preservation of the global balance of security and the maintenance of the U.S. leadership positions in the world. I believe that every diplomat of Ukraine, every military who is engaged in military diplomatic activity, that is, in contact with foreign partners, must record this thesis as the first point in his plan. Next, it is no less important to convince, first of all, the United States to take into account the rapid development of the means of armed struggle and the technology of its use. Again, I repeat, at the top level of the Pentagon and therefore in the White House, because Trump believes that Hexy is doing terrific work. So, further, scientific and technical progress has already led to an insane, incredible change on the battlefield, which has completely changed the nature of war. This new nature will become the basis for global security, but so far as the general writes, it remains unknown to the United States of America, right? We recently found out that the President of the United States does not know that the state language of Liberia is English. What are we talking about here? Some kind of global security, a new form of war, and then the general continues. This is another threat to the loss of global leadership. Yes, gentlemen, yes. I have been saying since the opening of my channel that now it is such a time that any country, not only the United States, should manage professionals. Professionals, once again professionals. This is something that in Ukraine, well, simply with some sadistic persistence, is eradicated. It is eradicated within 2 years by the personal ambitions of individual representatives of power. This is a crime against the state. Therefore, the general writes, it is extremely important to attract the United States not only to the process of armament of Ukraine, but also to the process of modernization of its own weapons used in the war of Ukraine against Russia. Yes, to me, the whole thing in the Pentagon is already rethinking. So, in general, the budget, almost trillion, which was recently adopted in the United States of America, it must be overshadowed because it is embedded under the projects that are not needed at all now. They have lived for themselves and lived in February of 1922. Now everything needs to be completely different in different quantities, different nomenclature, and so on, but all this needs to be explained. This is all that Ukraine can provide to the United States of America as a priceless intellectual capital, accumulated over the years of the war. Well, what needs to be done? It is necessary to carry out a number of measured steps. The simplest decision can be to first create a joint scientific and analytical center where experts from Ukraine and representatives of the relevant U.S. institutes can independently assess other events and facts. Yes, to begin with, it is necessary to create a center where experts from Ukraine, who know and understand what modern war is, will tell it to the Americans. They will influence the further development of thoughts in the Pentagon, the further development of the military-industrial complex and generally the theories and strategies of war in the modern world. And this is a brilliant idea, and let's work on it. And from here, everything else, gentlemen, everything else from the understanding that we are interdependent. That is, the United States now depends on the success or failure of Ukraine. But they need to explain this because the brains are filled with fat. This is exactly what I am telling you based on my 33 years living in the United States of America. Self-pleasure somewhere, chivalry, which appeared in the United States of America after 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which fell apart on its own initiative of internal, so to speak, problems, and not because America won it all, as it was presented here. Well, that's how it is. That is, this is a colossal example of how it is possible in 35 years to spoil one's position as the only superpower, in order to bring everyone back to their senses and come back again, not to whine, not to give up the position of China now, but to return what can still be returned. The United States needs Ukraine. Therefore, this is what I want to tell you in conclusion, so to speak. Ukraine is not just a theater of military actions, it is a crossroads of civilization. This is where a new thought is born: military, political, geostrategic. Ukraine will not stand up without strong allies, but the West, without Ukraine as an ally, will lose its positions in relation to China. Without Ukraine, new alliances are impossible. Yes, they are impossible, because these alliances will be built under old decals until February 2022. Without the victory of Ukraine, the United States will lose its leadership, and China and Russia will write the rules of the future world. This is how it is. That is, the world is no longer built on declarations. The world is now stumbling in the reality of the Union and in technological laboratories. Without Ukraine, there will be no alliances. Without alliances, there will be no order. Without order, chaos will win. And chaos is a goal, it is an ideology, it is a practice of such a country as the Russian Federation, which is the vassal of China. That is, in fact, what I wanted to tell you, dear friends. Maybe the material, well, the material is certainly not entertaining. The material is for intellectuals, those who want to understand in detail, so to speak, at a high level the current situation. This is just for them. Well, and taking into account, as my foreign colleagues assume, that they listen and are smart and high-ranking people in the influential countries of the Western world, this is also for them. I repeat, I think that Valery Zaluzhny should share his thoughts on the pages of the largest intellectual and military political publications of the world, which I wish him well. On the basis of the complex, gentlemen, everything is clear, everything is clear, everything is real, and it is important that the ice has touched Washington. Therefore, as usual in the conclusions, glory to Ukraine and its armed forces, the enemy will be defeated, the victory will be ours. Dear friends, I wish you endurance of courage and firm faith in our inevitable victory. See you soon.